Well, it looks like folks are continuing to trickle in, but I'm going to get us started. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us today to our series, Torah as a Light, Wisdom Through the Darkness. Today we'll be learning with Pardesniks North American faculty member, Deborah. A few things before we begin together. First, I have a few updates to share from Pardesniks in Jerusalem. In their continued efforts to volunteer to help Israelis in need due to the war, students a few days ago took to the fields to help a farmer plant his onion crops. And I have a few photos of that I'm going to share with you all because I think it's really beautiful. So hopefully you can all see this now. Just a few lovely photos of students enjoying themselves while helping out a farmer in need of the assistance. So there's that wonderful example of the volunteer efforts our students have been engaged in. Our students are also building community in really beautiful ways still. We have a bus full of students, staff, and faculty who are headed out on their first overnight Tiyul of the year tomorrow. They're going to be just outside of Jerusalem in the Arava and Negev deserts. The trip is fully approved by and coordinated with all official security channels. So we have a lot of high hopes for that experience. It's going to include hiking, swimming, touring, campfire, barbecue, learning, and bonding in all kinds of ways. So I know our students and staff and faculty are so excited for this chance to spend some real quality time together. And final update from Jerusalem, our year program students are continuing to return from abroad to rejoin the year program in person in Jerusalem, which we are all so grateful for. There are more slated to rejoin the community after Hanukkah. So we're continuing to welcome folks and really excited to do that. So now I want to take the moment to dedicate today's learning and this whole learning series in general, as we have been doing, to the loved ones in the Pardes family who have been called into service in Israel. So Monica has just posted a link to the full list of their names in the chat. We invite you to share in the chat now any names of any additional loved ones to whom you would also like to dedicate today's learning. While you are sharing those names in the chat, we're all going to take the next 30 seconds together to set an intention for our learning in silence. Please join me. Thank you all so much. Thank you for being here with us today. The source sheet is going to be shared on screen as well as provided in the chat with a link that will be provided. I think right now it's been shared there. So that's it for me. I'm handing it over to Deborah. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for that update, Haley, and thank you all for taking time out of your Monday to come together to learn in this way with me and with all of our Pardes community here. Monica, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and put the source sheet up. And while Monica does that, the theme for our learning today is praising God in difficult times. And I think that when we encounter moments of crisis, moments of tragedy, as we have in these last couple of months, it can raise all kinds of different challenges. And one of those challenges is theological. It can raise questions about our relationship with God. Is God the God that we thought we knew? Is God acting in the way that we thought God would act? How can we understand who God is and where God is in times like these? And I want to just sort of note, starting off, first, that one space in which those challenges can become really fraught both is when our own lived experience kind of raises those questions, but also in moments of prayer, when we find ourselves reciting words and wondering, is this actually what I think? Do I really mean this? Do I really believe this? When the world is not behaving the way we think the world should, all of a sudden, those prayers can become difficult. And this is a problem that is on some level, or a challenge that is on some level unique to each person, right? In their own lived experience, everyone's going to encounter this in a different way. Based on who they are and what's going on in their world. But this is also a challenge that our people have encountered and wrestled with for millennia, dating back to the times of the Tanakh, and particularly the times of the prophets. So I want to explore with you today a few different ways that our tradition has negotiated these challenges, beginning with the first source on the source sheet, which is from the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, sometimes called the Palestinian Talmud. If you have studied Talmud or Gemara before, you have probably primarily studied the Bavli. So this is the sort of lesser known of the two Talmudim. And in this passage, the Yerushalmi discusses the prophets having this exact challenge. So Rabbi Pinchas said that Moshe fixed the formula of prayer. Amar Rabbi Pinchas, Moshe hitkin matba'a shel tefillah. And then this phrase in bold, Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, V'ha-Norah. I'm just going to pause here for a moment and ask if you want to just raise your hand use the little hand raise thing if you know this. Where have you heard this phrase? Where do we say this phrase? Anyone want to? This formula. The Amidah, okay, I'm seeing it in the chat. Thank you, wonderful. This is part of our daily prayer practice, our most core part of our prayer practice. We say that God is Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, V'ha-Norah, the great, strong, or mighty, and awesome God, right? I can think of sort of no formulation that's probably more familiar to us than some language from the Amidah. And the Yerushalmi tells us that Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, didn't say this whole formula. Instead, he just said, great and strong, right? Amar Ha'el Hagadol, Velo Amar Hanorah, right? Hagadol Hagibor Velo Amar Hanorah. So why did he change the prayer in this way? Why did he say strong, but not say awesome? And the Yerushalmi tells us, because one may rightly be called strong because he sees the destruction and is silent. So the prophet Jeremiah lives during the destruction of the temple. And in a funny way, perhaps in an unexpected way, it's the very reality of the destruction, God's observation of the Horban, and God's not doing anything, not saying anything, that is a signal of God's strength. But because the temple is associated for Jeremiah so closely with this idea of God's awesomeness, he omits the word awesome, because awesome is associated with the temple, and the Yerushalmi here brings a verse from Psalms that associates the language of awesomeness specifically with the temple. So here we have one example of a prophet who lives through a calamity, right? And that calamity, that lived experience, changes the way that he is able to or wants to address God and prayer. And then the Yerushalmi brings us another example, this time from Daniel. Daniel Amar Ha'el Hagadol V'ha-Norah, Velo Amar Hagibor, right? Daniel said, great and awesome God, but he did not say mighty or strong. So he too modifies this formula, again, based on his lived experience, right? Daniel is a prophet in exile. So he says, looking around at the people, right? His sons are put in neck irons. Where is God's strength? The people are oppressed. We're not powerful. I don't see divine power around me. But Daniel himself experiences miracles, direct miracles in his life, right? Saved from the fiery furnace. So he still says awesome. Why did he say awesome? He may well be called the awesome by the wonders he did for us in the fiery oven. So each prophet here is modifying the language of prayer that was fixed according to this tradition by Moshe because of his own lived experience. And then the Yerushalmi tells us, when the men of the great assembly came, they returned greatness to its former place. In other words, they returned to the original structure of the prayer that Moshe instituted. And they say, everyone is going to say from now on, Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, V'Hanorah, the formula that we have today in the Amidah. And then I think the Yerushalmi asks a really key question. Does flesh and blood have the power to set limits in these matters? Can people really change the way we talk about God, limit how we describe God in prayer, right? Because removing these attributes from the prayer is kind of a limitation. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar, this is at the end of your source with the bolded language here, Yod'in hen haniviim she'eloheihen emet. The prophets know that their God is truth. Ve'enan machnifin lo, and they will not fawn before him. The prophets are not interested in offering empty flattery to God. The prophets know God, maybe even in a different, more direct way than we perhaps know God. They know that ultimately to them, the most important midah of God, the most important attribute is truth and being honest when they approach God, when they praise God, when they describe God. And so they are able to modify this prayer. Now, I think the thing that's really interesting here is, on the one hand, perhaps this means we have a model from the prophets that we too are free to modify what we say to God in prayer. Perhaps we too can modify the language. You know, we have a fixed liturgy in the Amidah, language that's already established for us. Maybe we too can modify it if we don't feel that it corresponds to what we see in the world. We don't feel able to say those words. But the Yerushalmi also kind of cautions against that, right? By asking this question, does flesh and blood really have the matter? Can people really do this? And I think here Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar's response is illuminating, right? The prophets know that their God is truth. Not everybody. Maybe it's only the domain of these specific individuals who are able to do this. It doesn't necessarily mean that everybody is. I think the Yerushalmi kind of cautions, but leaves it open. Okay. So now I want to just go on to the next source and look at another example. Again, something that's probably very familiar to you from the prayer book, of a place where it seems like maybe people who were not the prophets did alter the language a little bit, although not language that was fixed by Moshe necessarily. But here, this is one of the blessings before the Shema, Yotzer Or, and I'm just going to focus on the end after sort of the benediction formula. It says, God is the one who Yotzer Or Uvore Choshech, Oseh Shalom Uvore Et HaKol. God is the former of light, the creator of darkness, maker of peace, and creator of all things. Again, this is a formula that's probably familiar to many of you. But if we go down a little bit, and if there's any way to see this in line with the one on the next page, I don't know. Okay, so we'll go down a little bit. Keep that in mind. You all probably know the language from this blessing. This is really resonant with language from the book of Isaiah, but it's not the same. So often this happens. Many of our prayers quote freely from Tanakh in various ways, excerpts of verses. And here we can see the verse that's echoed very strongly. Yotzer Or Uvore Choshech, Oseh Shalom Uvore Ra. Not Vore Et HaKol, Vore Ra. The one who creates light, forms light and creates darkness, who makes, this translation is it's from the JPS, but it's a little bit odd here, who makes peace, right? Same as what we see in the blessing, and creates evil, creates wickedness. And in an interesting way here, I think that what Isaiah is highlighting is that God is the author of everything in the world. God is the creator of the entirety of the world, which is the idea in our blessing, right? Creator of all things. But when people were putting this language into the Siddur, it was uncomfortable to sort of focus on the fact that if God is the creator of all things, that means God is also the creator of evil in some way, right? If you think about everything, that includes evil. So that idea from Isaiah is the same in the blessing, but it's been softened a little bit. The language has been shifted a little bit, likely because when the Siddur was being formulated, that was a difficult thing to say in prayer. That wasn't the orientation that people wanted to bring into their approach to God, right? In the blessings of the Shema, to bring sort of as their focus, a focus on God as the author of evil. That's not really the orientation they wanted. So it's not necessarily exactly a different message from Isaiah, but it's a different nuance. So here we see people actually, again, changing language a little bit to make the blessing sort of, or the language of prayer, more in line with what they actually experience or want to experience in the world. Okay, so that's kind of the first one, actually changing the language from text, from tradition, to fit people's experience or what they believe about God in a more direct way. All right, let's go on to our next source here, where we see a different strategy. And again, I expect that this will be familiar to many of you. This passage from Shemot, from the book of Exodus, appears not in our daily prayer practice, but in the Machzor, in prayers that we say on the holidays. And again, the words in bold are the words that you would find in the Machzor. And I'm going to just read those here. Hashem, Hashem, El Rachum v'Chanun, Erech Apayim v'Rav Chesed v'Emet, Notzer Chesed la'alafim, Noser Avon v'Fesha v'Chata'a v'Nakeh. Right? The Lord, a God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in kindness and faithfulness, extending kindness to the thousandth generation, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. Okay, so this language really emphasizes what about God. If you had to summarize what this is saying about God, if you wanted to throw it in the chat in one or two words, what does this bolded passage say about God? What is the character of God? What is the nature of God? Compassionate, mercy, excellent. Okay, exactly. Forgiving, good, forgiving. This is God as we want God to be. Patient, I love it. God as we want God to be when we approach God in repentance, right? On the high holidays. We know that, that we have erred, that we are imperfect, and we hope, we believe that God is forgiving, God is compassionate, and we emphasize and highlight that in the prayers on the high holidays. But interestingly, right, that is not the whole story in Exodus, in Shemot, because it goes on, if you look back at the source, right after V'chata'a v'nakeh, lo yinakeh, poked avon avot al banim, ve'al vanim, al shilishim, ve'al ribeim, right? God does not forgive, does not remit all punishment, but visits the iniquity of parents upon children and children's children upon the third and fourth generation. All of a sudden, this is not quite the same picture of the most forgiving, compassionate, patient, source of all good God, right? This is also true of God. And the rabbis do not change Exodus, right? They don't change what the text of the Torah tells us about the nature of God, but instead they use a very classical technique, very common in Midrash, known as atomization, which is they just cut the verse. They cut it off before it gets to the part that they don't want to focus on. It's not that God never punishes anybody or is always compassionate, but during the time of repentance, what we want to focus on and what we want to invoke, the way we want to approach God in prayer is by emphasizing that compassionate nature. Okay, great. So maybe, as Val is suggesting here, maybe not empathetic in terms of understanding transgressions. Maybe, I mean, it's interesting because it does say forgiving transgression, but then maybe not always. And I think part of what all of these different examples highlight, although they're using slightly different techniques, is that God's nature is vast. God's nature. God is the author of wickedness as well as all goodness. God is forgiving and also can be harsh in punishment. All of that is true. But we as humans, when we approach God in prayer, when we're entering into that relationship, sometimes need or want to emphasize different aspects of that relationship, to focus on different things in prayer. Okay, that the motivations might not be relevant. Thank you for clarifying, Gal. Okay, and I saw a couple comments, a couple questions earlier. I'll try to get back to those at the end, but I'm going to keep going for now. So I'm not trying to ignore you, Robert and Andrew. I'll try to get back to your questions. But I want to just continue to build on this idea for a moment, which is, so what then are we doing in prayer? Is prayer, as the prophets suggest, about honesty, about coming as the source from the Yerushalmi suggests, saying exactly what you think, exactly what you feel, describing the world as you see it, God as you understand it, being honest? Is that the core relationship that we have with God in prayer? That may be one of them. But I also think, as these traditions suggest, part of what we sometimes do in prayer is try to speak into reality, or speak into being a new reality by describing God or describing the world as if it were a certain way, or as if God were a certain way. And there's this fascinating, it's a long text from Brachot here, which gets at this question in a couple of different ways. But it suggests that God prays as well as humans. And there's this little midrashic piece at the beginning here that I'm just going to summarize, building on the language of Isaiah, a verse in Isaiah, which says, I'll bring them to my holy mountain, and I will gladden them in the house of my prayer, Beit Tefillati, that's the language of the text, not Beit Tefillatam, the house of their prayer. So the rabbis interpret that means that God also prays, right? My prayer, God prays. So what then would God pray for? And we have a tradition here, this is from, again, the Bavli Brachot, that Rav Zutra, the son of Tuvia, says in the name of Rav, this is God's prayer. Yehi ratzon milfanai. May it be my will, right? Because it's God praying about God's self. Sheyikbshu rachamai et kosai v'yigolu rachamai al midotai ve'et naheg im banai v'midat rachamim ve'ekanes lahem lifni mishurat hadin. Okay, so may it be my will that I am the following way, that my compassion overcomes my anger, that my compassion overcomes all my other midot, all my other attributes, that I conduct myself compassionately towards my children, that I behave with compassion. And then this somewhat cryptic phrase at the end, that I enter before them lifni mishurat hadin. I didn't actually translate this phrase because it's debated among the scholars what the best translation is and exactly how to understand it. It's sometimes translated as going beyond the letter of the law. It's sometimes understood as withdrawing from, not demanding everything that you could demand. It's sometimes understood as acting in sort of a closer relationship, making decisions that are really specific to the person and the situation, that are influenced by personal relationships. There's a lot of different scholarship on this. But what it is clear is that it's consistently, or very frequently, especially in earlier rabbinic texts, associated with compassion, as it is here. So it has something to do here with acting not harshly, not sort of in strict justice, but compassionately. And that this is sort of what God, that in praying this, God tries to transform God's self in this way, orient God's self in this way. And then if we go on in this source, there's a different version in which this is actually a blessing that one of the rabbis, Rabbi Ishmael, gives to God in this encounter in the Holy of Holies. May it be your will that you are this way, exact same language as we saw before. But again, this seems to be potentially Rabbi Ishmael hoping that this will make God compassionate, right? That this will encourage God to be the God we hope to encounter, this Holy Holies. That's Yom Kippur, right? That's that encounter on the holiest day of the year, day of repentance, right? You want God to be compassionate in that moment. So that by praying for this, or by describing God in this way, that will somehow bring about that reality. And I think not necessarily oriented towards God, but in the last source I brought today, if we can just go down a little bit, again, probably a familiar text to many of you from Birkat Hamazon. This is a line that's always really struck me every time I say it. that I think is an example of kind of trying to speak into reality, a world that we do not actually have, at least in my experience. Na'ar hayiti gam zakanti v'lo ra'iti tzadik ne'ezav. I have been young and now I am old, and yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken. So I don't know if I'm old yet, but I've certainly been young, and I'm not sure that I've never seen the righteous forsaken. I've actually seen righteous people suffer. I've seen things that seems like they've been forsaken. And there's a way in which saying this line, I think, is an attempt to say, this is the world I believe as it can be, right? I'm going to affirm that even though I don't understand, even though it looks to me like the righteous have been forsaken, I'm going to affirm that they have not been, that they're in some way that I don't understand, they have not been forsaken, or that the world is going to come about in some way so that this is not what happens. And I think that is sort of a third and important aspect of what happens when we speak in prayer, not just honestly describing the world that we're in, but also speaking into reality a different existence, whether that's through reinterpreting existing words, or even saying words intentionally that maybe don't quite match our experience. So the tradition really gives us all of these as options when we encounter aspects of prayer that do not seem to correspond to our lived experience, right? There's an option of trying to change the language potentially. At least the prophets provide that model, to be honest and say, I don't feel like I know how to affirm this. There's an option of reinterpreting what the words in front of us mean, highlighting, focusing on the words that we do connect to and kind of ignoring the little pieces that we're not so sure about. And then there's also this option of saying, yes, I'm going to say this full formula. I'm going to say temples destroyed, but I'm going to say great, mighty, and awesome, because I, in doing so, believe that that will help me to understand how that's still true, or help me to bring about a world in which that still seems to be true. Okay, I see here that we are almost out of time. I know there are a couple of questions in the chat. So I'm going to go back to those just for a second, because I don't want to have ignored them. I'm sorry. Were the men of the Great Assembly sitting when the Second Temple still stood? Great question. The men of the, yeah, they potentially, yes. Sitting when the Second Temple still stood would have been natural to restore the word awesome. What I think is significant here is that that formulation, they fixed it not just for their own time, but they sort of refixed it as everybody should kind of say this, or that's the way that the Yerushalmi at least seems to suggest it. Yes, the restoration makes sense when of awesome once the Second Temple is there, but also since that time, and again, the age of prophecy is over by the time we get to the men of the Great Assembly. But since that time, we don't see anybody challenging that formulation again, at least not that the Yerushalmi brings to us. Great question and great point, Andrew. Omitting references to animal sacrifices as a form of feeling like I don't see in the world, or as a form of, I'm not sure if that has to do with sort of, it feels like we shouldn't do this, or because the temple's not there, we can't do this. But certainly, I think I'm just going to
say,
yes,
as a part of our worship, which is no longer relevant
today. Yes. So certainly we see movements in the modern period which have changed the language of prayer to do things like omit this reference, both because it doesn't seem relevant anymore, but also because some people hope that there will be a day when there's another temple and those sacrifices will be restored. And some people do not hope for that day, do not hope that the restoration of animal sacrifices will come. And that is reflected. We see many modern movements who've changed the language of prayer to better reflect their commitments, the world that they see, the world that they want to see, the God that they understand. And so I think actually, thank you for raising that, Robert, because it is a good example of the same kind of modification that we saw the prophets doing, that some people feel like this is still an option really open to us today. All right, I think that we are out of time.
Great. How about we do this? I see there is another question. So why don't I wrap up, and then if those who want to stay on for the question, we'll welcome you to do so. Just a big thank you to Deborah. That was a beautiful shiur. Thank you for giving us a little perspective. We're living in our one little moment in time, and it's appreciative to look back, both backwards and then again, hopefully forwards. That prayer represents a world both that we've seen, that we currently see, in the world we want to see in the future. We will be back in this group together this coming Thursday, same time, same Zoom link. And Alana Gleichler Bloom from our Jerusalem campus will be sharing some Torah with us that afternoon. So I look forward to seeing you then. And then I'll flip it back to Deborah for that last question, if you'd like to stay on with us.
Sure, great. So everyone feel free if you got to go. I know this is a busy time. This last question, the idea that God prays seemed to contradict the idea of God as perfect. Fantastic question, fantastic theological question, Gabriel. My first answer to you would be that the rabbis do not seem to struggle with the idea of God as not being perfect, at least not in the way that we think of God as being perfect often. So there's a philosophical move that happens sort of later in time, largely led by figures like Maimonides, that perfect means sort of unchanging. And the rabbis envision, if we read through Midrash, if we read through the Gemara, a very dynamic God. And that is the God that struggles at times to master various different impulses and desires. Sometimes God's love overcomes justice, right? Sometimes you want to forgive because you love the person so much, but justice demands that they need to be punished in some way because otherwise it's unjust to the person who was harmed. There are all kinds of rabbinic texts about this. So here it seems, I think the rabbis hold the possibility that there are lots of right choices or right ways for God to behave. And God is balancing among those options and trying in this moment, God's praying to be a particular version of God's perfect self, if that makes sense. So I think it's just a different idea about perfection. It's a great question. Thank you. And thank you all for being here with me. Lovely to learn with all of you. And I hope to learn with you all again soon.